Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video, and today we're talking about Shadow Priest in Season 1 with War Within in Mythic Plus. So in this video I'm going to go over talents and some gearing stuff and some rotation stuff, all with your Shadow Priest in Season 1 to hopefully get you started playing in the first couple weeks of the season. Now I will be kind of expecting some balancing changes that might tweak what I'm saying in some of this guide, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, although I'm just really bad at that. The IcyVeins guide that's linked in the description will be fully updated anytime that they make changes. If things are substantial enough, I will record a new video, but be sure, especially if you're watching this a couple weeks after the season actually started in earnest, double check that there isn't kind of a later video to watch or something with newer information in the IcyVeins guide or otherwise. Without further ado, let's dive into talents. All right, so for Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus, you have a couple choices here, although not quite as many as the raid choices, and that's mainly with our hero talents being a little bit more further apart when it comes to Mythic Plus. So by default, I suggest everyone start off with Archon, and in particular, the triple idol build that I'm showing on screen now. Now with this build, this is going to be kind of your generic build that can actually go all the way up to high push keys. There's a little bit of caveat there depending on where exactly you want your damage, but this build will really scale up as your key level goes up. In early key levels, this will be a little bit hard, but that's just kind of Shadow Priest in a nutshell. There's not a whole lot of things you can do to make low keys feel better. Unfortunately, when stuff dies too quick, Shadow Priest just doesn't have enough time to ramp. But this build will really kind of start popping off, especially when you're able to start pulling larger things or pull packs together, or when stuff starts living just like 50 second, 60 second plus long packs. This is the one that's really going to start popping off. So depending on your key level and your item level, this might take a bit for you to hit, but this will be your eventual end goal for the build that can do a lot of AoE damage while still doing competitive single target damage for Shadow Priest's current profile. So with this, you do have a couple choices here, and know that this is coming in just right off the start of the season, so things might be changing. You'll see some footage of me playing a little bit of this on the other side here while I explain the talents. Now with this, like I mentioned, we're going triple idol build with Void Eruption and Mind Flay. Now with this, there is a little bit of changes depending on if you've played triple idol in the past, but a lot of it should be quite similar. One of the biggest things that's going to be similar is Mind's Eye. So by default, I suggest everyone play Mind's Eye this season, especially once you get access to the tier set. And what this means is you want to prioritize only sending Devouring Plague on the priority target in the pack. This is typically the thing that has the most health, so as you're rolling up to a pack, get everything dotted, find the thing that is the most important to kill first, and focus your Devouring Plagues into that mob. Again, usually this is the highest health target, but it could be one that's got a particularly nasty cast or something like that as well. Otherwise, you're really just kind of focused on playing the rotation as normally and being sure to use your stuff on cooldown as much as possible. You do have a couple choices here that I'll call out in the actual hero talent tree. So if you prefer Shock Pulse for the actual slow with enemies, you can use that. Although personally, I really like Incessant Screams for the kind of double stop that you get whenever you're able to play this. And please, for the love of God, press Psychic Scream. It's such a good button. It's really, really strong. We get a lot of complaints that people just don't use it, and it's really good, and you should. With this as well, you can choose to run Energy Compression or Sustained Potency. I would suggest defaulting to Energy Compression just because it does more raw AoE for most key levels that people are doing. Although as you go up in key level, if you're finding that the pack is still living, but your cooldowns have already ended, you might actually get a bit more value out of running Sustained Potency there. Although what key level this actually starts at is currently unknown. It just kind of depends on where you're at. So if you're looking for like longer cooldowns with less damage coming from Halo, you can check out Sustained Potency. But the data that we're showing suggests that Energy Compression is still kind of the suggested choice for most people at like reasonable target AoE counts, just because of how Halo scales, with the amount of targets that you're facing. Now, you do have one other choice that I'll mention with this build. If you're showing that your group just needs more single target and the extra AoE damage isn't exactly what you're looking for, there is an option to run a bit more single target here. You actually drop Idol of Yogg-Saron and pick up Mastermind and Insidious Ire, which are massive single target gains here. You're able to get about 6% more single target damage by doing this change, but because we drop Yogg-Saron, you're losing about 10%, give or take, in top end AoE. So depending on what you're looking for, you can run this as well. Just note, you have to kind of pick what you'd rather have. This is a lot closer to single target to what you'd find in like the single target plus crash build that we get from raiding, that kind of thing. This is just one option to run there if you're finding out that bosses are just living too long and you need more boss damage. Now, with all of the builds in Mythic Plus, I do take Silence and Mental Fortitude all of the time. Strictly speaking, this is a DPS loss. Unfortunately, we can't pick both of these and Dispersion and everything else in this top section without losing some damage. You're going to lose about 1 to 2% damage for doing this, but I just think this utility is so good that dropping either one of these for most people is going to be pretty hard. If we go back to the standard Mythic Plus build, if you're in a spot where you can drop the defensive from Mental Fortitude or the utility from Silence, you can put this point back into Maddening Touch for that build if that's something that you think you can pull off. But again, like I said, as a default, I think everyone should be taking these talents all of the time. All right, now let's talk about Voidweaver inside of Mythic Plus. So this is definitely where more of a downside is going to be in terms of like its viability here, which is just strictly speaking where Voidweaver aligns with cooldowns. Voidweaver strongly prefers playing with Dark Ascension on every single fight type until you get to massive AoE. The problem is Void Eruption in particular just isn't good single target or low target count for Voidweaver. It unfortunately just doesn't buff enough of our spells, and there's a lot of anti-synergy with having to now fit in Void Bolt and getting less buffed Dark Entropic Rift windows. So unfortunately this build will start to fall off. Now, you could, as you get into really high keys, try out this exact same build with Void Eruption. But again, like I said, it's just a lot of anti-synergy, then you'd just be better off playing Archon at that point. So if you're just doing lower keys, and what I mean by lower keys is keys where the most mobs that you're pulling is 8 targets, and that's really rare. So this is really like 1 pack at a time type dungeons. Or if you're in a spot where pulls just aren't lasting very long, so if you're in a moment where like, yeah, hey, the pull is only lasting like 20 to 30 seconds. Voidweaver loves those kind of short pull windows. And so until you're hitting the point where pulls are lasting for like a minute or you're chain pulling packs together, Voidweaver should still be able to be competitive depending on what you want to do. Although again, as you get up higher, Archon's going to start winning out these fights. A lot of this is going to look pretty similar to what Voidweaver was already running. Unfortunately, Triple Idol just doesn't make sense for this kind of build. There's no synergy with Yogg-Saron or Apparitions. So we kind of just lean into the existing like buff Void Blast as much as we can, and also kind of play a little bit around Depth of Shadows as well. So with this, if you didn't already notice, the kind of big change from the rating builds is we are suggesting to take Depth of Shadows over Void Wraith. If you want more single target, you can still pick up Void Wraith, but being able to play Depth of Shadows and especially snipe out low health targets with Shadow or Death to get the extra Insanity generation more than anything is going to be really powerful with this build and something you kind of want to keep an eye on as you're playing around it. But otherwise, it's going to play pretty similarly, although you, of course, are playing with Dark Ascension now, so you do have shorter windows that are like desyncing yet again. So with this build, it's a little hard to maintain because you have Void Torrent on a 30-second cooldown, Dark Ascension on a minute cooldown, and PI on a 2-minute cooldown. So you have to be kind of liberal with your cooldown usage or knowing how to sync or desync your cooldowns correctly so that you have all these things together when you absolutely need them for the most burst in the build. So keeping those in mind, you want to try to use them on cooldown as much as possible and just be aware of what cooldowns you have available for you. Otherwise, this is kind of Voidweaver in a nutshell. There's not a whole lot of variance here with this talent build. Like I said, it does kind of cap off at a certain point, so there's not like alternatives here other than what I'm showing here. So that is Voidweaver inside of Mythic Plus. Let's move on to how you play these from a rotational perspective. All right, so let's cover rotation. I'm going to kind of give a little bit of examples, and in the background you'll see some footage of me playing the spec both in kind of like an opener environment as well as some footage that I was doing Mythic Plus on in the beta. So similar to the raid build and the raid guide that we talked about, you still want to kind of keep in mind your goals for playing the spec. And if you can get these goals down, you're going to have a better time inside of AoE. You'll find that like AoE as a Shadow Priest is going to be pretty different than what you're playing with other specs, just because of how our AoE damage actually works. If you can actually get these goals correct, you don't have to get too deep in the weeds with like the actual priority list. Getting these goals down will get you like 80-90% of the way there. Get these down first and then focus on the more in-depth priority list that we'll cover in a second. So first of all, you want to really focus on your dots in AoE. As a Shadow Priest, this is going to be your most important thing, and you really want to kind of get this covered first, which is as much as possible, you really need to be focused on pulling with the tank. So what does that mean? A lot of people wait to do their damage because they're worried about taking aggro or whatever else it is until the packs are all grouped together and everyone's ready to AoE. If you're doing that as a Shadow Priest, you're leaving a lot of damage on the table, and it's going to feel way more frustrating. Obviously, this is a lot harder in lower keys. You've probably already noticed this in like heroic dungeons when everything's dying so quickly. But as you get into higher keys, this will eventually feel better. And the way that we play around this is you want to pull with the tank. The way you do that is you walk up to the pack with the tank. As soon as the tank pulls, you are pulling with him. So what that means is you want to be pressing Fade, which removes your aggro. You do not generate aggro if someone's already hit that target. It'll prefer that target instead. And then you can start using Vampiric Touch. What this looks like is typically it's going to take a tank, let's say 5-10 seconds at most to really gather the pack. During those 5 to 10 seconds, you can be using Fade, Vampiric Touch, just tab spam on all of the targets in the pack as it's being gathered up. And then once it's finally grouped and centered, then you use Shadow Crash. Shadow Crash will dot 8 targets, and it usually, if it works correctly, prefers hitting targets that do not already have Vampiric Touch active. So by doing this, you kind of start the pull off with more dots than you would have otherwise without losing any damage because the pack, the pull isn't actually started until it's grouped up for most people. This isn't going to deal a whole lot of damage. You just need to keep in mind your Fade buff. Once Fade expires, you'll go back to dealing normal threat. So you don't want to hit anything that hasn't already been hit by the tank or has some amount of aggro to them. So you do want to be a little bit careful with that. Depending on the tank you're playing with, different tanks can have different levels of like snap AoE threat depending on what they're doing. So make sure you keep that in mind depending on what tank that you're actually playing with. But doing that is really important as well from our cooldown perspective. This is what allows you to sustain dots on more targets than you otherwise would. If you're in a pull and the pack's already going, you really don't ever want to manually dot more than 4 targets at a time is like the rough rule, and only do that if they're like big priority targets that you care about dotting. So with this, at that point, you can then roll into your cooldowns if the pack will live long enough, which is things like Void Eruption, Power Infusion, even Shadow Fiend as the pack is being gathered just for something. Honestly, Shadow Fiend is super underwhelming. Don't worry about it too much. But with Void Eruption, as things get stacked, your Void Bolts will be able to sustain your dots on the pack, assuming you're targeting something roughly in the middle, because Void Bolts does have like a refresh radius. I think it's like 8 yards or so. So things do need to be roughly grouped to make that work. But then you can sustain whatever dots you casted pre-pull here. Now, once the pack has been dotted, you're ready to go, your cooldowns are blasting, you really want to pick the target to focus your Devouring Plague cast into. Like I mentioned before, you want to focus the target that has like usually the most health or is the most deadly for the pack. This will change pack to pack, but usually you pick the thing with the most health, and that's your kind of priority target where you're going to dump your Devouring Plagues into. Because of the way Psychic Link works in our Mastery, you always want to be hitting the target that has your Devouring Plague active so that the Psychic Link damage gets the biggest modifier that absolutely can. It doesn't double dip that modifier. In our case, there's no reason to spread Devouring Plague this season. We just don't get enough value out of doing that. So don't worry about that. If there are like 2 priority targets, you can kind of consider throwing Devouring Plagues at both of them. This is a super complex rotation for a lot of people to worry though. I just wouldn't worry about it currently. I think you're not getting enough value out of doing that. Just pick the highest health priority target or big mob and focus your Devouring Plagues into that. After that, the goals get kind of simple. You just kind of want to use your short cooldown spells to generate insanity like Void Bolt, Mind Blast, and Surge of Insanity. Get these kind of things on cooldown quickly. And make sure that you're not losing casts of your bigger AoE spells like Void Torrent and Halo. And then, of course, you can kind of fill with your kind of stuff like Mind Flay and that kind of thing. Otherwise, the rotation is going to play out very, very similarly to what we do inside of a rating perspective. Because our rotation inside of AoE is basically just our single target rotation, not a whole lot here is changing. You can kind of switch up what you're doing depending on how soon something is dying. If you really want to burst something down, you can kind of short circuit the Mind Flay and Insanity stuff and really slam those. But usually you'll wait to use those if they're about to cap on charges or you just don't have anything else to press. And really you're just trying to use your time to make sure that you're not wasting spells. That's the whole goal of the rotation. It's going to be a little different than what we're used to just because of how tuning exactly works. In particular, Mind Blast just does not hit very hard right now. So you notice in the rotation, Mind Blast is pretty low on priority, which is intentional. It just doesn't hit that hard. So don't worry about it too much. But yeah, that's kind of the rough goals from a rotation perspective as a Shadow Priest. If you haven't already seen it, I also want to highlight the Mythic Plus page that I have in IcyVeins. This page has a lot of really good information in it that I've just kind of accumulated over time. So if you're curious about how some of these mechanics works, Question. I mean, I've covered most of it here. So we have like talent builds when the builds make sense that we already covered earlier in the video. We also have like a single target breakdown to see what the gap is between some of this stuff. And there's also a lot of really good stuff in here from a utility perspective, different macros, stuns, stops, kind of talking about where things make sense. And one thing that's really useful that I personally like using a lot of the time is my talent switcher here, my talent cheat sheet. Shadow Priest and Priest in general has quite a lot of utility choices for talents. So with this, what I've done is you can select the dungeon on the left-hand side here, and then whatever affixes are active for that week, and it'll give you suggestions of what talents to start off with for that environment. So if you're in Mist of Turnus Scythe, for example, it just says, make sure you take Mass Dispel. Siege of Borealis, Stone Vault, nothing specific for that. Dawnbreaker, there's not a whole lot for a lot of these dungeons this season, but, this does give you a little bit of like, oh, hey, make sure you start off with these for those dungeons. Now, if you want to see a specific one, you can go to actually click on that dungeon. Gives you specific tips for bosses of like, hey, when to look out for using defensives, where that utility actually makes sense if you actually want that like detailed information. Right now, I've only covered this with like boss information. I'm hoping to add like trash specific tips later on in the season and look out for that kind of coming soon. And there's also a couple stuff in here for the actual affixes if you want to talk about like how the affixes work and ways that we can counter them. I already mentioned this already. There's like a burst damage section as well if you want to cover that, as well as a defense and survivability guide. So if you're trying to push into high keys, good section to look at as well, like how to actually gear your character or spec your character out to make sure that you're as tanky as you possibly can be, and how to actually use your defenses. So make sure you check this out if you haven't seen it already. All right, the last thing I want to cover in this video is with gearing. So I've already done quite a lot on kind of gearing in general in my previous videos. Some things just to call out if you haven't already seen. I did a video on crafted gear, so check that out if you haven't, about what are the best crafts for Mythic Plus. All that guidance will be up to date here, and the video is more or less still accurate. Now, what I want to cover in this video that I didn't already mention and just kind of highlight again is trinkets. So we'll start off with there first. And the reason I want to start there is because I think this is what most people are kind of gravitating towards as far as, what to look for in their gear. So not a whole lot is different from a raiding perspective, but there are a couple things to call out. Your top trinkets from like a raid perspective to farm to get good value in Mythic Plus are easily Spy Master's Web for sure. This trinket is really great. You get the burst for as many packs as you really want. If you only want it for like the big packs in the dungeon, you can do that. Or it's every 20 seconds, you can use it to some extent. It's just a great trinket. This thing is awesome. Everyone's going to want it. It's going to be kind of hard to get, but if you can, it's our easily best trinket by a long, long way. From a rating perspective, the other one to think about is Treacherous Transmitter. This guy is also a good burst damage trinket, particularly with AoE. It's less good in single target, but can still produce pretty good results if you're okay using it. There's like a puzzle you have to solve every time you do this, which is either like jumping, chasing a ball, standing on a transmitter, that kind of thing. But if you can get good use out of it, it does pretty well from like an AoE burst scenario. The other trinkets in raiding just aren't that good for us in Mythic Plus, and which is somewhat good, is that you can kind of farm really good trinkets in Mythic Plus for Mythic Plus. So for us, the kind of couple trinkets just to call out: Arakara Sackbrood, really strong. Unbound Changeling, Empowering Crystal, and Gale of Shadows. These are the similar top 4 for raiding as well. Get these trinkets as soon as you can and kind of play around with which ones you prefer to use. A lot of them are just kind of like a trinket soup, so whichever one you get at highest item level, if one of them appears in the vault at like Myth Track, you're probably going to use it. But usually it's going to be Arakara Sackbrood plus one of these other 3, depending on which one is like higher item level, or if you get one with like Avoidance or Leech on it, that kind of thing. And that is kind of trinkets in a nutshell. The other thing I want to cover is your stat priority. So this is something that's confused a lot of people. So just to kind of go over it, especially contrasting it from a raiding environment, we are still Haste Mastery Focus as our top 2 secondary stats in Mythic Plus. And things shift a little bit more in that in raiding, we lean more towards Mastery for more single target damage. But in AoE, we get more value out of keeping them more even. So if you're trying to gear your Shadow Priest for Mythic Plus and AoE specifically, you want to kind of keep your haste and mastery rating dead even as much as you really can within reason, right? Don't let haste get super far ahead of mastery. Don't let mastery get super far ahead of haste. Try to keep them even, and that's going to be your rough guidelines here for doing the most damage and the most overall, is to keep them even, and then prioritize crit and then versatility kind of last after that. Otherwise, your stats should fall into place if you just follow those kind of simple rules there. Okay, that's all we have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have questions, let me know in the comments below. I try to read as much as I can. Let me know if you're looking forward to playing Shadow Priest in Season 1 of Mythic Plus. Big thank you to everyone that supports me on YouTube, Patreon, Twitch, all of the lovely sites. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.